Hello, Internet. Welcome to another Wednesday's serial. I want to talk today because I had a comic book thing happen and it was a little hard, so I want to kind of step through it and explain my thinking. I don't expect everyone's going to agree with me, but I'm curious to get it out. So, in short, uh, Gary Dugan, who's the current writer on X-Men, posted kind of an open question thing. And there was this bit about flags. And they said ultimately that it's this human concept they don't want to deal with. It sounds like the design was going to be too hard. They're like, kind of, what are we pushing this for if it's going to be hard work? And what does it add to the story? Is my guess as to what really happened. Doesn't matter. He said human concept. But I pushed and said, but being an ethno state is 100% great, essentially. And he said, it's not an ethno state. So let's kind of break it down from here. So, is Genosha an ethno state? Now, first, I will admit, and I did ask this, but no one was willing to answer this question, which I found interesting. Is it not an ethno state because technically being a mutant is not an ethnicity? If that's the case, then by definition, I'd be wrong. But then is it a species state? That's kind of taking the fiction versus the metaphor and splitting hairs. But it is kind of a valid criticism of what I was saying. No one really wanted to latch on that. They seem more concerned about me saying that it's not an ethno state for what that arises, which it is. They only allow in mutants. They won't allow in humans. There are two notable exceptions to that. One is Shogo, who is Jubilee's child at this time, who has turned into a dragon for a not insignificant part of the Excalibur run that character has been primarily in through these books. Which I thought lended, like, I didn't know Shogo wasn't a mutant because so far the child is slightly older than infant, I guess, but still being carried around, not walking on its own for the most part. And so I thought the mutant X gene wasn't necessarily detectable at that point. That's the way I understood it based on prior fiction of most of the X-Men I've read. That very well could have changed at some point. I'm not saying I know everything here, but that seemed to me to be very much splitting a hair, especially considering the infinite child is under the care of one of the people there. The second one is the lover of, I forget who, but one of the characters of the Huxpox X Factor character, I believe, Julian from Alpha Flight. I'm probably saying that wrong. Anyways, one of the characters from X Factor had a boyfriend who was there, who was gay and human. Okay. So we have like this notable live-in exception. Okay. That does soften it a bit, admittedly. But basically, policy is humans aren't allowed. And it starts to get dicier there when you look at how hardline that is in both respects. So, first is that, they don't allow humans on the island by and large. So, a very notable part of this is Franklin from the Fantastic Four was on the island making friends and kind of had a spot to hang out anyways, was allowed on the island, but wasn't even necessarily living there. There's some questions around it. And then this whole kerfuffle happened. That was the Fantastic Four X-Men mini that happened during this Huxpox era. And he lost his powers. And then what followed in the Fantastic Four comic, that was a pretty big issue for people who cared about this kind of thing at the time. Franklin was kicked off the island because his X gene was gone. A lot of people took issue with this, but in canon, that this is what has happened. That is on the page. So the minute his immune status was revoked, so is his invitation. That's really harsh Also, it should be noted, like, outside of when guests have been allowed on the island to tour in a very guided, like they always have a escort on them at all times sort of situation, nobody else is really allowed on the island. And that includes friends of the X-Men mutants prior. Like the Avengers aren't allowed on the island. Spider-Man in particular isn't on the island, who I always say was an X-Man because he taught at the school for a while and was did so, when the mutants are at a particularly low point, and did so per Logan's will. This is when Logan died for a couple of years. They held on to it for a hot minute, though they had Old Man Logan running, so neither here nor there for this. And that's brought on. Logan isn't really allowed to bring his human friends on, but he has a Krakoan gate basically in their backyard. I'm going to come back to that. And so this is a really harsh rule. It's not just a closed border. Like, this is completely restrictive and isolated one way, but yet has hooks across the world. Um, in today's political climate, with much more open borders, even more closed off societies that are very restrictive about immigration, people coming in to live there, much less visit, there's still some back and forth because that's what it takes to be a global player. And the fact that this isn't addressed or is handled with the Genosian culture sets a political precedent. If it was that alone, I wouldn't say so much. But okay, so they don't allow humans on the island to a very restrictive degree, partially because they are keeping secrets. Added to that, they bring everyone onto the island who's a mutant, no matter what. So, to that degree, we're talking about mutants who have made a career of killing other mutants. Sabretooth, Mystique, Wildchild, the Marauders, everyone in the Mutant Massacre who perpetrated the Mutant Massacre. And discounting Gambit, who's earned his stripes since then, who didn't really know and only led them to the tunnels, didn't quite know. Like, that was handled forever ago. But I mean, the ones who actually did the killing there, all on the island. No ex-nay for them. And the only one that's been really handled was Sabretooth. That happened early, and he's going to be let out soon because he has his own series coming. How that happens, how that plays out, I don't know. I haven't read it yet. I'll read it a month later, whatever. But we know something's happening there. He's the one of two characters that they've imprisoned, as far as I've read, in this kind of like hole. That says a lot too, because if they're going to allow people who notably murdered and made mutants' lives worse, just because they are mutants, that's really a big part of what I say is making an ethno-state. It is defined solely by mutantdom, and not only, as many people have pointed to say, well, they're just trying to survive and now they're thriving and you have a problem with it. Well, I'm reading the story and I'm taking it as fiction, but I'm taking the allegory where the story has led me. And that leads to a very questionable place that, with those two elements combined, say it's an ethno-state based on, again, we're assuming mutantdom is an ethnicity, not a species thing here. That defines it right there with those two elements, which is one rule. So that's pretty hard and fast, and that is to the text. Sans really, I don't think Shogo even counts as an exception given the situation. There's really only one exception. And the idea that there's one exception really proves the rule more than anything else, because that seems like a concession to bring one more mutant onto the island. I, it's it's worrying. Now, the other concession and argument against that, I guess, that no one else did bring up that I know of with something I just finished, is that the Scarlet Witch is on the island. She's not technically immune. She's technically an inhuman, if I remember right. Whatever, not technically X gene, but powered and closely associated to the mutants. And the fact that they're letting her on despite everything, and I know the story's there to explain it, it still doesn't make sense given what she did to the population. It's baffling to me. They should want her head still. So I do want to note, and I don't want to be adding people, I doubt anybody who watches my video would like attack this person, but I'm just going to read it. If you go through my stuff, you'll find it anyways. I don't know. The argument against also what I said is it's not an ethno-state. It's literally people from different ethnicities, faith, creeds, and more, and they aren't actively trying to exterminate humans and have explicit laws against it. They specifically moved to an uninhabited place to not displace anyone. Okay, let's break that down because there's actually a lot in there. So it's not an ethno-state because there are other ethnicities. So I'm saying mutantdom is that we've already been through this. I think that kind of defeats his point of what he's saying, though it is X-Men. There's a lot of stuff mixing coming in. But when you have Homo superior mutants coming together like this, and it is defined solely by that, it takes on a different thing, especially when expressly multiple times the entire premise of this is that they are establishing their own society as their own people. It's taking the genetics that bind them and creating a state around that. I can't shake it when people are telling me this isn't the case and that that's not a viable reading. I don't know how anyone's reading it the other way, honestly. I hear what this guy's saying. I see the point of it. But the second they went to the Krakoan era, this Hoxpox thing, that was out the window. I feel like that was an argument back when they were like in San Francisco, or in Ultimate when they were stuck in the desert. Was it Utah? I forget where, just Midwest. The way they wrote it really didn't matter because they were just literally nowhere. Middle of the United States, and just kind of establishing their own state like it was Burning Man forever. When they're doing it like that, I think there's a lot more argument to they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to come up on their own. Something also akin, as I brought up later, to Mutant Town and what is happening with Ninja Turtles now. That is like a slum that they are trying to develop into a community, and there's a big fight that has to happen with the patrols and the borders that are keeping them in there for that to kind of move above a slum status. But in that book you can see that building happening, and they are just trying to survive, and there's internal politics and problems still, yes, but it's on a very different level, and X-Men has been on those different levels before, and that has stayed true. This era is intentionally something very different. So I feel like I have to put forward the better argument in order to get the better argument against, and I just wasn't able to do that on Twitter the other night, especially when I was being frankly dogpiled on. It's hard to maintain cogent, and it's hard to express more complicated ideals in Twitter bits when it's being fired like that. They aren't trying to exterminate humans. In fact, they explicitly have laws against it. Yeah, but they also have a What Works squad that's killing people, and they are still killing people from time to time, but it's bad. Killing's bad everywhere, and they have laws against killing. Who doesn't? It doesn't really actually mean that much. And then they specifically moved to an uninhabited place to not displace anyone. That is false. They moved to Genosha because it was land that they could control, not because they weren't going to displace anyone for the native argument. They did it for control and establishing themselves, partially based on It depends on how you read it, because this was retconned in Inferno. Some of the boons that had happened that became an important part of Hoxpox, they reveal in the narrative, kind of bore fruit from what they were doing with Krakoa, kind of accidentally, but it was also partially because it was a mutant island and they were just staying on that theme, I guess. It's not, it was a different motive and a different angle, and the idea that they were purposely not trying to displace everyone, everything's happy and lucky, was just not what was happening in the story. So that bothered me a little. That was not right. And then I followed up with a harder swing, which led to a reaction which got me, which is part of the reason I'm making this video. But also warrants more talk, considering how much I've rambled about the first half. We'll see how this goes. I said basically, well, what did I say exactly? I said, because, so Garry Dugan said, as discussed at length, the flag is a human concept. They want to go with that. And I said, being an ethos 100%, we've been here. They said and then he said they tried everything else to want to be exterminated, called me out by name. Is that so wrong? And then here's where I made the harder swing. I said, I tend to think following fascist ideology is bad. Yes. That's hard swing. I'll get back to that. He responded with, same, mutinism isn't fascist. However, whoever comes away with that suffers from a poor reading comprehension. Fuck you. Okay, so let's dig into it. So it turns out, if you actually dig into it, more so than other political ideologies, fascism is harder to define than others. But essentially, as Merriam-Webster says, I know it's bad talking, but in this case, one, often capitalized, a political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic, social regimentation, and forcible suppression of oppression. Now, does Genosha mean all of that? No. The first part, very much yes. All the ethnostate stuff we said, yes. The exultant of being mutant, and there's more to that we'll get to, is key. It is not a dictatorial leader technically, if you break down what they're doing in Genosha, despite the council, which is something of a facade, it's a dictatorial oligarchy. But that's really digging deep, and people might take issue because that's the dirty secret. But I mean, there's usually a bit of unveiling that happens with fascist nations as they build in a more modern setting. Okay, severe economic and social regimentation. Very much that is happening in the story, as they don't technically have an economy. Everything's provided for you so long as you are part of the island, which, if you take that with any negative reading whatsoever, is the highest level of exactly that. And then the forcible suppression of opposition. That's interesting here because it actually hasn't come up yet, except once, and it was very much that. And so far, it only happened in Inferno, really. Psychically, that happened. It's all there on the page. And is there some quibble room? Yes. But some of the quibble room actually is, sadly, a big part of how fascism manifests. So if you start listening and hearing to people who are on fascist watches and watching out for white nationalism on the rise, because typically that's how it goes in the real world, people who feel they're superior to others. Homo superior, it's there. Fascism will root and rise and take different forms based on the countries they are in through the guises of what is most important to that nation. So you see how fascism rises differently in the first generation of it, kind of between Germany, Italy, in a couple different places, and so on. And so seeing that is hard, because that's a lot of the most brutal periods of history. And it's also not as akin to what is happening in Genosha with more modern uprisings like we've seen a la January 6th, the Proud Boys, and so on here in America and across the pond in Britain and Europe. So I find that interesting, because if you look at the allegories, what Hickman did in his run, not what Duggan has ever touched and frankly steered relatively clear of, paints an eerie picture. It seemed purposeful to me, knowing some of the different things to look for. So obviously, as I made this claim, eventually someone asked for it, and it was hard because in order for me to do this in full, I'm not even going to do that for this video, because I would have to link every claim I make to a source. If you follow someone like Robert Evans, or someone who follows fascist risings in America in particular very closely, especially tied to internet culture, as that sadly has had a lot to do with it, though what doesn't the internet culture touch anymore? It's there. It would be one hell of a homework assignment to assign this, so I'm going to try to say this the best I can, pointing to different things, but I'm not going to have a litany of links for where I'm at. I just don't think I have the audience or pull to justify the effort that it would take to put forth for this. So why do I think Genosha has ties to a fascist state? Let me try to root this as based on kind of what I said to these people. As was asked for me, what actual connections to the real world fascists do you see all this connected to? Okay. The rise of fascism in more democratic states, which Genosha is somewhat purporting to be, happens differently. There's very much the need for us versus them. Genosha is based on, we are mutants, the humans are trying to kill us, this is the line. There's no allowance for human allies, and keep in mind, metahumans or any of that, or even really playing outside the pool of Earth, which is possible with the metafiction of Marvel, only really happens with the Sword Book, which is taking on a different angle. So really, Genosha itself is pitted against the world, and has tried to do so from an interesting place of offering this drug that will cure all kinds of ills for the idea of express sovereignty. Again, it's a secretive state on its own, wants to be left alone in a way that is unique to these times and has been for several generations. So it is mutants versus others. That idea of us versus them is very present when you start hearing about fascists and white supremacists talk at a certain level. It's white supremacists because they want white people on one side and other people on the other. They very much believe in that separation. If you hear like Richard Spencer talk when he's trying to be more amicable, when the power level isn't being expressed, he will push for the idea that, like Mexicans belong in Mexico and the Japanese belong in Japan, etc., etc. Every race needs its place so that they can thrive and be together, because people coming together doesn't work for whatever cockamamie reasons they have. It's disgusting, and I don't want to go too far down the hole there. But this idea of bring people together. Again, mutants, humans not coming together. Xavier's dream is dead. We go there. Then there's the air of superiority. Now, they are homo superior. Now, if we just left that alone based on the fiction, that's what it was forever, that'd be fine. However, there's other seeds of the idea of superiority that come through. Most notably through the inclusion of characters like Magneto, Apocalypse, and Sinister, who are not just simply on the island, but are the ones who help found and are on the board, consistently running things. With the exception of Apocalypse, who technically isn't on the board anymore. He left to go do whatever, which actually we'll get to again. Apocalypse is a whole bit of this, but seeds to how fascism rises in more current situations. Apocalypse push for this idea of the strong versus the weak. Again, a very fascist ideal, and it is seated in a lot of the specific Krakoan practices that they've brought up throughout the book. And then one thing that was fresh in my mind, because there's a lot of talk about this, was the push for gallantry. A lot of fascists want to believe in, if they believe that they are superior, right? They'll have this gallantry, a lot of gilded things, the Age of Gold, pushing forward for a new world, the space race, if it happened a little sooner or things that happened differently later. The idea of the superior race needing to be there would be winning. The idea of the Olympics, and when, Hitler's white men lost to the black man, that was a blow for them, because they believed the pedestal, the shining lights, those good things are supposed to go to those who are superior. Now, keep in mind, with mutantdom, that takes on a whole different tone, because most of the characters are equipped with some sort of deadly force by birthright. It doesn't play well to the metafiction to put that with this sort of political undertone. So the push for gallantry came up more fervently, though, with Planet Size X-Men #1, when they had this whole gala, right? If you've been following this at all, there was this giant gala that Krakoa held, that had all these dignitaries, they had Avengers, a bunch of other important Marvel characters there. To wine and dine people, there's a big announcement. So what's the deal? So it's all this nice stuff, and there's all this dress and all this build to it, which is where the focus is. But keep in mind, you're some sort of dignitary, trying to see what this new nation's about, and they have some big surprise, and they've already made this weird political play with offering drugs to your countries for sovereignty, but you may or may not have accepted it. And then they show in real time, it only takes moments, they geofit a planet in front of you, make it thrive with life, and claim dominion not only over that, but the solar system in the name of mutantdom. It's a power play. It's a huge fucking power play. And you can't tell me at this point that they're trying to survive, that they're the underfooted minority. That metaphor died in that moment. They are in a position of power. They are growing. And what's still secret, but is very present in the meta, that undercuts almost any argument against them. For the moment, I'm sure it's going to blow up at some point, but for the moment, death is not a factor. Part of the mutant condition is to be reborn when you die. I don't think they understand understood fully like I understood part of it is because the characters die all the time. Why not bring it in, right? Metafiction wise, it makes sense, but when you start attaching that again to all these political ideas and all the other things I'm talking about, it takes on another undercurrent. Now, another big one, and this is where I'm going to bring back Apocalypse, is cultural ties to militarization and combat. Again, literally the strong versus the weak. Now, when a mutant dies, when they come back, in order to regain their powers, they have to fight for it. And it's not like a sparring match. It's pretty fucking brutal. This is part of who they are. It's literally tied to them becoming again who they are. And I haven't seen it played through, but there's an undercurrent here that if a mutant has to fight to get their powers back, if they fail or if they refuse the combat, are they then excised from the island because they're unwilling to do so? I don't know. It hasn't come up in the narrative, but it says something there. Now, the one who established this practice was Apocalypse. Again, strong versus the weak. Now, how does this tie back to the real world? Well, a lot of fascists tie fighting to who they are and what they do in practice. The Proud Boys have their little fight clubs regularly. And a big reason for that is for when protests get hairy, they're able to deal with it. They're also able to escalate and push because the cops aren't usually willing to push against them because there's a lot of ties to white nationalism and police that isn't so relevant for what we're talking about here with X-Men. But this push for fighting militarization like that as part of the culture is an inherently fascist ideal that has remained consistent across all fascist uprisings. Also, the idea that you are better, again, being above disease, is part of this as well. And we haven't seen any mutants really get sick outside of one bit with X-Force, which was actually like a attack. So that's later though. And then the other big one, again, to the isolation and what they're doing, is not allowing outside ideas to pollute young minds. Freedom, expression of thought. They will push for freedom of speech in a certain way, but the certain speech and ideals and ideas that are presented to them are very narrow. On Krakoa, they've invented their own language and they put forth certain things to the kids, but any sort of outside culture, how that's handled is unclear but clearly restricted. There's a big deal about even Logan getting his beer and it having to be smuggled in. And so I really question, like the idea of like books or culture, any of that, where any of that's coming from and how that's going to influence those who are essentially stuck on the island. It's dubious. And to that, again, to the isolationism, a big part I feel is that the mutants are essentially cut off for the most part, but their most prominent members, the X-Men who are allowed in the outside world, are always out doing big noble things in the name of mutantdom to try to like push this big ideal. You'll see this with fascists as well. They'll pick their representatives and they go out and do certain things, but they also won't necessarily come back and reveal the full truth to their community. Where we're at with that hasn't necessarily happened, but we're seeing some of that secrecy and problem coming up in the character of Ben Urch that's happening in Dugan's X-Men run as well. Now, to say that ties to fascism as well is a much lighter tie in that way, but that political undercurrent and deceit is there as well. So, it's another factor. Another thing that I pushed on that people disagreed with me with is coming back, like I said, the Krakoan gates. Wolverine can get to his friend's backyard anytime he wants. His friends can't cross through. Now, this is the fictional side of it, but I guess the feeling, though, and this is something I don't understand how people could say Krakoa is being peaceful when, if you're on the outside looking in, it seems like they're poised to at least make a statement, again, of dominion. Keep in mind, they've pushed galactically for this already. But they have gates in every major nation. I know there's some exceptions for where they can't be. Whether or not they can't or won't is more the question. But it's in every nation. They can show up where they want with as many people as they want, essentially as fast as they want. And the reaction for the rest of the world is limited. In an arms race, they have a huge advantage. And they've set anchor essentially everywhere. When submarines were invented, they were naval warfare, and they were a big advantage at first. What happened over time, though, is as duration was able to be longer, the idea of keeping a submarine in an area so that it could deploy and certain soldiers could come up without necessarily being seen at the time by others, just detecting the presence, the idea that they could, not that they were going to, was viewed as a diplomatic assault, as a problem. Similar things with carriers and airplanes as things continue. We hear about it every now and again in the news, like some spy plane is caught just flying over a space it's not supposed to be. It's not doing anything. It's not dropping bombs. It's just flying over, maybe taking some pictures. Just the presence, the idea that being there is a diplomatic problem. Now, this doesn't tie necessarily directly to the fascism or the ethnostate, but what it does tie to is this general feeling. The mutants are just trying to live. They're just trying to live their best lives, man. It's good. And it's nice to see this fiction where all these characters we love who are the minorities are getting to just be, man. Really? If you look at the political implications and take all the factors in, I genuinely feel it paints a very different picture. I genuinely feel the story they're telling versus what Garry Dugan is telling me I'm a fool for seeing is hard when every one of those bits is on the page. I don't think I'm reading too deeply here for a lot of it. At the very least, for political malcontentment. Direct fascism, I understand not everyone's going to agree with me. That is a bit more of a swing, but I do think it's present based on everything I said. Don't need to run that down again. Ethnostate, unquestionably. I don't understand how anyone could see otherwise. You put it all together, it paints a hairy picture. So this all leads to the last little bit Garry Dugan said to me. Responding to, I think following fascist ideology is bad, yes, he responds, same, mutism isn't fascist, however. Anyone who comes away with that suffers from poor reading comprehension. I respond, if that's what you think, I implore you to see how eerily close things are. The comparison is scary. He responds, no, the creeping fascism outside your window is legitimately scary. Oh, I agree with that. I agree with that on a level I don't think he comprehends or understands. Hating or fearing mutants now? You're doing it because they're successful. But maybe Ortrus is hiring. I respond, Homo superior lording over the solar system now that they feel they are stronger and above weak humans who aren't allowed in their haven are passing judgment. You can't tell me it's all good vibes when Apocalypse and Sinister help set things up. Now, that goes to a lot of what I said. I didn't touch on Sinister necessarily specifically as we're breaking down all this, but he is pushing genes together to create that which is more superior, all with malcontent and stretching things. He fits the mold. There is nothing particularly more useful for him than pointing to what Apocalypse brought in. And that reminds me of one part I said I was going to mention and I didn't, is the idea that Apocalypse left, but the fingerprint he left on the island is huge. He won over a number of the characters, most particularly Richter, who's been in Excalibur now, but was kind of floating around a little bit, if I remember right. Maybe I'm misremembering who was in what book earlier. It hardly matters. But we see in him that, like, this legacy of Apocalypse telling us that we can do better, telling us that we do these things, telling us that we fight for the future, telling us that we do this, seeds the idea and puts it through and then is prophesized and repeated and spread all throughout the culture and all throughout the people. His memory and him being lionized after he left actually makes his message stronger than if he was there and was able to be refuted on several points, point blank, as the situation arose more dreadfully to some of the things he would have had to have dealt with if he was actually there. We see this with fascist risings as well, which is where a big part of that internet culture comes in, where some of these ideas are dropped by certain people, but these supposed truths are repeated in the face of events. Whereas if some person was forced to take these truths and hold it to the events on a more human level, they would fall and the message would fracture, because nothing can withstand that kind of repeated assault from every different angle. It's a big part why some people get so wrapped up in these ideologies, and they're so unshakable because they're so certain about their convictions, because they're held to this gilded standard. So I saw that in particular, and that was eerie to me. The other thing that came out from what Duggan is saying is the fascism creeping outside your window is legitimately scary, yes. Hating or fearing mutants now because you're doing it because they're successful? Okay. I'm of Jewish descent. Recently, last year, when Israel was doing very questionable things and people are cracking down on them, I had to question the response for myself, but also looking at it from both sides. I mean, it's unquestionable that the things people in Israel were doing were horrible. I mean, they were attacking journalists, they were attacking civilians. They were the aggressors. The people of Israel are people bonded by trauma, by a long history of being an oppressed minority. And now that they've had a moment to collect, gather some resources, own a little bit of land, and push to want more, and feel that they're owed certain things and that their actions are beyond reproach after a few generations of isolating themselves a bit more. they strike out like that. Again, if you look at the seeds of Krakoa, I'm not saying Israel is fascist, but I am saying they are an aggressive state taking negative actions. And again, what Krakoa is doing there with that seems eerily similar to that as well. So, I don't know. I see the fiction, I see the parallels to certain things I've seen in history more recently. I see a lot of troubling things, but relevant things going on with the X-Men in relation to how minorities are perceived and handling things in the current world, which is what X-Men is supposed to be commenting on. And it's hard. So if you've made it through this video, I'd ask you to comment on a couple things for me. Am I crazy? Am I reading it poorly? And also, do you think I'm swinging too hard? Is it not fascist at all? Am I reading into it too much? And if so, where are you standing on this more generally? I'm not expecting a response to the whole kit and caboodle here, but I don't know. I think it's a lot. Thanks. Good night. Be well. Keep reading. And keep reading intelligently.